It all started with one contract, a desperate lie, and a promise that nothing would change between them. But desperation has a terrible habit of rewriting history. And when the past gets involved, no plan survives intact. Evelyn Allen stared at the nameplate on the mahogany door like it was a verdict she couldn't appeal. Roger David, CEO. 3 missed calls from her aunt. 7 emails from the bank. 1 demolition notice that she absolutely, positively could not ignore. She adjusted her blazer for the 3rd time. The navy fabric was expensive but outdated, tailored 2 years ago when she still believed her restoration business would take off, when the estate's foundation hadn't started crumbling, when she hadn't needed help from the one man who'd broken her heart. Her phone buzzed. She pressed play on the voicemail anyway. Evie, the county called again. If we don't secure funding by quarter end, they're moving forward with demolition. I know meeting with Roger is hard, but sweetheart, you have to make this work. This is our last chance. Evelyn let her head fall back against the wall with a quiet thud. Perfect. Of course it would be him. The boy who'd ghosted her in college was now the only man who could save her childhood home. Meanwhile, she restored historic buildings for a living but couldn't even afford to fix her own family's crumbling legacy. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the bank, final notice, payment overdue. The door swung open before she could knock. And there he was. Roger David hadn't changed much in 10 years. Taller, broader in the shoulders, the same storm gray eyes that once softened when he looked at her. His charcoal suit probably cost more than her last 3 contracts combined. Ms. Allen. You're right on time. Not Evelyn. Not Evie. Just polite acknowledgement from a man who once knew exactly how she took her coffee. The corner office overlooked the city. Roger gestured to the conference table where another man sat, silver-haired and radiating the kind of wealth that made decisions about other people's legacies over lunch. This is Harrison Glassner. He sits on our investment board. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She prepared to pitch to Roger, not some board member who looked like he ate struggling businesses for breakfast. Glassner's handshake was brief, dismissive. I've reviewed your proposal. Ambitious project, but your financials are concerning. No stable partnerships, no institutional backing. What makes you think you can execute a project of this scale? The question landed like a slap. Heat crawled up Evelyn's neck. I have 10 years of experience. In small residential projects. Glassner's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm not questioning your passion, Ms. Allen. I'm questioning your capacity. She opened her mouth, then closed it. He wasn't wrong. She was drowning in debt, working from a closet-sized office, taking contracts she was overqualified for just to survive. I have support, she heard herself say. The lie formed before she could stop it, born from desperation and wounded pride. I'm not working alone. I have a partner. A financial partner. Someone established, with institutional credibility. Glassner raised an eyebrow. And who might that be? Evelyn's mind raced. Her eyes darted to Roger, standing by the window, his expression unreadable. Actually, Roger's voice cut through the tension, smooth and unhurried, she's referring to me. Time stopped. Roger crossed to the table, his hand coming to rest on the back of her chair. The gesture was casual, possessive, absolutely deliberate. Ms. Allen and I have been discussing this project for several months. I'm personally invested in seeing the Allen estate restored. Glassner's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. You're partnering on a residential restoration? That's outside your usual portfolio. I'm diversifying. Roger's hand moved to Evelyn's shoulder. And when your fiancé is as passionate about a project as Evelyn is about her family's estate, you find a way to make it work. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Fiancé. Evelyn couldn't breathe. Could only feel Roger's fingers pressing gently against her shoulder blade, a warning or reassurance, she couldn't tell which. Your fiancé? Glassner looked between them, reassessing. I wasn't aware you were engaged, David. We've kept it quiet. For professional reasons. Play along, his touch seemed to say. Evelyn found her voice. We wanted to keep our personal and professional lives separate. Until now. Glassner studied them, then his expression thawed. Well. This changes things considerably. If you're personally backing this project, the risk profile shifts entirely. He stood. Send me the updated proposal with your investment terms. We'll fast-track the approval. You'll have it by Friday, Roger said. The door clicked shut. Silence flooded the room. Roger walked back to the window, hands in his pockets. You're welcome. Evelyn stood on shaking legs. What the hell was that? That was me saving your project. By lying? By telling Glassner we're engaged? Roger turned to face her, something flickering behind the professional mask. Something that looked almost like anger. You lied first. I just made your lie believable. I didn't ask you to. You were drowning. One more question and your entire pitch would have collapsed. His voice was controlled fury. So yes, I stepped in. And what happens now? When he expects wedding plans? Roger's jaw tightened. Then we give him what he expects. You can't be serious. I'm always serious, Ms. Allen. He crossed his arms. Here's what's going to happen. We sign a contract. A private agreement. You play the devoted fiancé for 3 months, long enough to secure funding and close my company's merger. In exchange, I provide the financial backing you need. This is insane. This is business. His gray eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating. Unless you'd prefer I call Glassner back and tell him the truth? That you're a struggling restorer who fabricated a partnership because you're desperate? The words hit like a physical blow. Why? Her voice cracked. Why would you do this? Something shifted in Roger's expression. For just a moment, she saw the boy from college. The one who'd kissed her in the rain and then vanished without explanation. Because, he said quietly, I owe you this much. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his mask sliding back. My assistant will send you the agreement. Read it. Sign it. He looked at her one last time. And Evelyn? Don't make me regret this favor. He left without waiting for a response. Evelyn stood alone in the vast office, her heart racing, her future hanging in the balance of a lie she'd accidentally told and a deal she'd just been forced to accept. She'd walked in desperate to save her home. She was leaving engaged to the man who'd broken her heart. And somehow, impossibly, both were now inextricably linked. The following morning, the atmosphere in Roger's office was stripped of its previous heat, replaced by the clinical chill of a legal transaction. On the sprawling mahogany desk lay a document bound in heavy vellum, the Strategic Partnership Agreement. It was a masterpiece of corporate coldness, detailing every expectation of their engagement with the precision of a property deed. Roger pushed a heavy silver pen toward her, his expression a mask of professional indifference. Section 4 outlines the public appearances. Section 8 covers the non-disclosure terms. Upon the successful closing of the David Group merger, the first installment of the Restoration Trust will be transferred to your estate's account. Evelyn scanned the lines, her heart aching at how easily their shared history had been reduced to clauses and subpoints. He needed a stable image to appease a conservative board, she needed a miracle to keep the roof over her head. It was a balanced trade, a perfect synergy of needs, yet the ink felt heavy as she pressed the nib to the paper. As she signed her name, her hand brushed against his, and for a fleeting second, the coldness shattered. A sharp, electric jolt flared between them, a reminder that no matter how many legal barriers they built, the blood in their veins still remembered the summer they had lost. Roger didn't pull away immediately. His gaze dropped to her lips, his jaw tightening as the silence in the room became thick and suffocating. 3 months, Evelyn, he murmured, his voice losing its corporate edge. Then the contract is void, and we both get exactly what we want. She looked at the twin signatures, black ink on white paper, and wondered if either of them actually knew what they wanted anymore. The deal was struck, the favor was official, and the trap was set. The drive to the mountain retreat was a study in suffocating silence, the tires of Roger's SUV crunching over fresh snow as the world turned a biting, crystalline white. When the manor finally loomed out of the mist, a fortress of glass and dark timber perched on a jagged ridge, it looked more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. Inside, the air was unnervingly still. "The geothermal system in the West Wing is down," Roger announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. He didn't look at her as he checked the digital thermostat, his jaw tight with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. "Maintenance can't get up the pass until the storm breaks. The master suite is the only room with a functional fireplace and backup heat." Evelyn felt the sudden, frantic skip of her pulse. This was the forced proximity her novels always warned about, yet the reality felt far more dangerous. The master suite was a sprawling sanctuary of velvet and shadows, dominated by a single, massive bed that looked like an altar to the history they had tried to bury. "One room," she whispered, the heat of her breath visible in the freezing air. Roger finally turned, his gray eyes dark and unreadable. "One room, Evelyn. It's just business, remember?" The barrier of pillows had vanished in the night, a casualty of restless sleep and a creeping mountain chill that seeped through the manor's timber walls. Evelyn drifted awake to a rhythmic thrum against her ear, the steady, heavy beat of a heart that didn't belong to her. She was tucked firmly into the curve of a powerful body, her back pressed against a furnace of heat that made the freezing room feel like a sanctuary. Roger's arm was a solid, proprietary weight draped over her waist, his hand splayed flat against her stomach as if anchoring her to him even in unconsciousness. The Ice King of the David Group, the man who moved through boardrooms with the lethal precision of a winter storm, was unexpectedly, devastatingly warm. His breath stirred the stray hairs at her temple, a soft, grounding huff of air that smelled faintly of the expensive cedarwood soap he used. Evelyn lay perfectly still, her own breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, the legal documents, the favor agreement, and the decade of carefully nurtured resentment simply dissolved. In the quiet of the dawn, stripped of his tailored suits and his biting sarcasm, Roger wasn't her adversary or her business partner. He was the only person who had ever made her feel truly safe. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she didn't want to move, she wanted to sink deeper into the protection of his arms, to let the lie of their engagement become the only truth she knew. Waking up beside him wasn't just a complication in her plan to save the estate, it was the moment she realized her heart had never actually left him. As he stirred, pulling her instinctively closer in his sleep, the independent armor she had spent years forging finally shattered, leaving only the raw, aching hope of a second chance. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory smiles, a battlefield where reputation was the only currency. Evelyn felt like an imposter in her emerald gown, her hand trembling where it rested on Roger's arm. The illusion held until Julian Vane, a rival developer with a reputation for stripping historic landmarks for scrap, cornered them near the champagne fountain. "A restorer, Roger? Really?" Julian's laugh was thin, condescending. He looked at Evelyn as if she were a smudge of dust on a blueprint. "I suppose even a man of your stature needs a charity project to soften his image before the merger. Just don't expect her to handle a real budget." Evelyn braced for the familiar sting of being dismissed, but the air beside her suddenly turned lethal. Roger didn't flinch, he stepped forward, his frame shielding her with a cold, absolute authority. "Evelyn isn't a project, Julian. She's the finest architect in this room, and her vision is the cornerstone of my firm's future. If you can't recognize her worth, you've clearly lost your edge." The silence that followed was a triumph. As Roger led her away, his hand lingering protectively at the small of her back, Evelyn realized the danger wasn't the rival, it was the man beside her. His defense hadn't been in the contract, and for the first time, her heart refused to believe they were still pretending. The storm raged outside, but the hearth cast a flickering gold over the cabin's living room. Evelyn swirled the remains of her Cabernet, the warmth of the fire finally loosening the knots in her chest. "Why did you do it, Roger?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you leave back then without a single word?" Roger stared into the embers, his shadow looming large against the timber walls. For the first time, the CEO's mask crumbled. "My father found out about us," he admitted, his voice thick with a decade of repressed pain. "He threatened to use his influence to blackball you before you even graduated. He told me if I didn't walk away, he'd ensure no firm in the country would ever hire an Allen." Evelyn froze. She had spent 10 years hating him for his coldness, never realizing he had sacrificed his own happiness to protect her career. Roger turned to her, the firelight catching the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I thought if I made you hate me, you'd move on and succeed. I wasn't rejecting you, Evie. I was saving you from my family's wreckage." The weight of the truth settled between them, heavier than any lie they had told the board. The wind howled against the timber frame of the manor, a primal scream that made the glass panes shudder in their tracks. Outside, the world had vanished into a blinding white void, but inside the master suite, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the shattering of a decade-long silence. The truth of Roger's sacrifice still hung between them, a bridge built over the ruins of their shared history. Evelyn watched him by the hearth, the flickering light carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. He looked nothing like the cold titan of industry she had faced in the boardroom. He looked like a man who had carried a burden alone for too long. When he finally turned to her, the professional distance that had been their armor for the last 2 weeks was gone, replaced by a raw, naked longing. "I spent 10 years trying to forget the way you looked in the light," Roger said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver down her spine. "I told myself this was just a favor. A business arrangement. But being here, waking up with you, it's the only time I've felt alive since the day I left." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She crossed the small gap between them, her hand trembling as she cupped his jaw. His skin was warm, his stubble grazing her palm. "Then stop pretending, Roger. No more contracts. No more favors." The kiss wasn't a slow burn, it was a flashpoint. It was 10 years of resentment, grief, and buried passion exploding all at once. Roger's hands found her waist, pulling her flesh against him with a desperation that broke her heart and healed it in the same breath. There was no strategic partnership here, no merger to secure, and no family estate to save. As he lifted her, his lips never leaving hers, the blizzard outside became a distant memory. In the heat of the firelight, they weren't characters in a charade or business partners bound by ink. They were just two people finally finding their way back to the only truth that mattered. That night, the bed they had shared out of necessity became a sanctuary of choice, and the favor was buried deep beneath the falling snow. The sanctuary of the mountain manor was shattered by the cold vibration of a phone against the nightstand. Morning had barely touched the peaks when the world clawed its way back in. Harrison Glassner hadn't waited for Friday, he had acted on an anonymous tip from Julian Vane. The favor agreement, the physical proof of their deception, had been leaked to the board. By the time they reached the David Group headquarters, the atmosphere was clinical and lethal. The board of directors sat in a semicircle of charcoal suits, the contract laying on the mahogany table like a corpse. Julian Vane stood in the corner, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. "The merger is contingent on the integrity of our leadership, Roger," Glassner stated, his voice devoid of its previous warmth. "This document suggests a fraudulent representation of your personal life to manipulate investment risk. It's a breach of ethics that the board cannot overlook." The ultimatum was delivered with surgical precision. Roger could denounce the arrangement as Evelyn's fabrication, sue her for misrepresentation to distance the firm from the scandal, and save his position as CEO. Or, he could stand by the fiancé he had purportedly lied for and face a vote of no confidence. Evelyn felt the walls closing in. This was the moment her hyper-independence had warned her about, the moment where her dreams became a liability to the man she loved. She stepped forward, her voice thick with a self-sacrificing resolve. "It was my idea. Roger was only trying to protect a historic." "Be quiet, Evelyn," Roger interrupted, but his tone wasn't cold. It was grounded. He stood up, slowly buttoning his blazer, stepping away from the head of the table. He didn't look at the contract, he looked only at her. "My father once told me that everything has a price," Roger said, his gaze shifting to the board with a terrifying stillness. "For 10 years, I believed him. I sacrificed the only thing that mattered to keep a seat at this table. But I'm done paying." He reached out, lacing his fingers through Evelyn's in front of everyone. "If this board thinks a man's worth is measured by a signed favor rather than the legacy he builds with the woman beside him, then you don't need me as your CEO. I resign." The golden light of a setting sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Allen estate, illuminating the dust motes dancing over freshly restored crown molding. The air no longer smelled of decay and dampness, but of cedar, beeswax, and new beginnings. Evelyn stood in the center of the grand foyer, her heart full as she traced the intricate carvings of the grand staircase. The house was breathing again, its pulse restored by the man who had walked away from a corporate empire just to protect her name. Roger appeared in the arched doorway, his silhouette framed by the sprawling oaks of the estate. He had traded his charcoal suits for a simple sweater, the sharp edges of the Titan replaced by a softness she had only seen in the quiet of the mountain cabin. He didn't look like a man who had lost his company, he looked like a man who had finally found his soul. "The final deed came through this morning," he said, his voice a low, warm vibration that echoed through the hall. He crossed the marble floor, stopping only when he was inches away, his presence a familiar, grounding heat. "The Allen estate is yours, Evelyn. Free and clear. No mergers, no boards, and no more lies." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "You gave up everything for this. For me. I spent so long trying to save this place alone, but it doesn't feel like home unless you're standing in it." Roger reached out, his thumb grazing her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I didn't give up anything that mattered. I spent 10 years chasing a ghost, thinking power could replace what I lost when I left you. I was wrong. This house, this life, it's only worth building if you're the foundation." He didn't reach for a vellum document or a silver pen this time. Instead, he reached into his pocket and sank slowly to one knee on the very marble where they had first danced as teenagers. He held out a ring, a vintage sapphire that mirrored the depth of the sea outside. "There is no contract this time, Evie. No 3-month expiration date and no professional favors. Just me, asking to spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost." His gray eyes, once cold as storm clouds, were now bright with a raw, unwavering devotion. "Will you marry me? For real? Forever?" Evelyn didn't need to think. She closed the distance between them, her hands framing his face as she pulled him up into a kiss that tasted of salt, fire, and a decade of longing finally brought to rest. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Always yes." The favor was over, and the real story had finally begun.